Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes here with Michael Moynihan from Newsweek and the Daily Beast, Klaus Jacob from Columbia University, Eric Kleinenberg from NYU, and Esther Arma of WBAI. We're talking about the ways in which the Sandy disaster has inserted climate into a political debate that had failed to mention it, and also the broader question about how we create politics of accountability and governance mechanisms that prepare us for the resiliency we will need in the coming era.
We need to retrofit our cities. Let's face it, we see in a disaster after disaster, year after year, cities that are unable to withstand the pressures of this new planet we live on. The ecosystem is different, the environment is different, and we will fundamentally need to rebuild at some level. Now, we are already investing tens of billions of dollars in the project of homeland security. We have tried to protect ourselves from terrorism. We have not done a very good job protecting ourselves from these completely predictable, routine events. And I think, at a minimum, we need to have a conversation about how to redirect Homeland Security so that this becomes an agency that actually safeguards us.
Well, this brings up a good point. This point that I'm obsessed with, and I ride this hobby horse on the show all the time, but that, we have this argument about government good or bad and, bureaucracy good or bad. And it's just the fact of the matter is bureaucratic performance exists on this massive spectrum. There are some bureaucracies that really, really work, and there are some that are dysfunctional disasters, right? And the question is, how do we move them? How do we get good governance out of our institutions? But the other question is, and Ed Markey just said something, this will be for climate the way that 9/11 changed our terrorism policy, and I'm not sure that what we built up. My inner libertarian started to say rut-row. I mean and I suspect you felt the same way.
We were talking about this in the break, and I mean, there is a libertarian argument or a smaller government argument to be made that we should prepare ourselves better for this, because and people can look up Robert Higgs as what happens during wartime and disasters. Is that if you do fear the size and the scope of government growing and just these big lumbering agencies that don't perform particularly well, they tend to come into existence after major catastrophic events. And this happens at 9/11, and you're not going to find any libertarian that's going to be a full-throated defender of Department of Homeland Security, for instance. And, that is one of the worries and one of the reasons that infrastructure to prevent this type of disaster is important.
Is there anyone who believes that the private sector at this moment is capable of doing the long-term planning and long-term strategizing that it will take to deal with the threat of climate change and retrofitting cities? I mean, I think one of the issues here is that government is the only kind of institution we have that can think about these things over the long term. We have the private sector acting in exceedingly short-term manner.
You disagree? No, Klaus disagrees.
Absolutely disagree. Look, scientists and even engineers thinking about that all the time and make statements. Often they come out as a very inconvenient truth. And the question is, how does the public respond to that inconvenient truth? The real major point here is, for instance, let's look at FEMA again. There are two tasks to FEMA. One is to respond after disasters. But the other that we have neglected since Clinton is to mitigate, to reduce the risk in the first place. And FEMA had been gutted from that task. And now we see the effects.
This is stats that come from a Political Science Journal article. Disaster spending since 1988, the amount of money the U.S. spends on disaster relief has increased 13 times, while the amount of spending on disaster preparedness has been flat.
Or reduced.
And what we have is this perverse political incentive, right? What happens politically if you're a politician and there's a disaster? You are on the news every day doing disaster relief. And that's when all the incentives are to turn on the spigots and the money to flow. And I think that's right. I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Right. But we don't have the same incentives to just prevent the disaster from happening in the first place, because what is the political gain to be gotten from just the bad thing never happened?
But here we need to place this
more cynical than I am.
But here we need to place this in some context as well. Let's remember, over the last several years of fiscal austerity, we have been cutting back programs at the local level, at the state levels, some fundamental programs that are for the protection of the most vulnerable people. Services for home care, for health care, for transportation, the kinds of things that we don't perceive perceive on an ordinary level, that we don't discuss very much in the media, but that actually produce resilience in communities. So when you see those numbers from FEMA, in some ways they speak for the politics of austerity. And I can tell you from spending a lot of time with the Obama disaster team, they are actually working on a politics of resilience, which is actually quite impressive and imaginative.
And there's a paradigm that disasters amplify existing stresses in the society.
Yes.
So what they bring out is all our fallacies. Okay?
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say that the trouble with that whole issue about it's the most vulnerable in society who are impacted is that has helped fuel the political partisan nature of how we think about preparedness and who is going to be prepared. I think what Sandy succeeds in doing, because it impacted the financial district,
equal opportunity disaster.
It literally is an equal.
Yeah.
But you need. In terms of the politics of how we deal with this issue, you needed an equal opportunity disaster in order to bring a much broader section of the populace to the idea and to the notion to get behind the science. Because I think the reality is, we were talking about this in the break, that with Katrina, there was a kind of injection of action. But there was also a real element of shame, and that shame silenced some of that action. The thing about Sandy is it impacts Republican land. It impacts the private sector, it impacts Wall Street specifically. That's who ended up underwater. My radio station is right on Wall Street. We ended up with 10 feet of water. And that conversation helps change the politics as well as the broader populace of people who are impacted by Sandy.
I think it's geographic more than anything else. I mean, the fact that it hit New York and that all of us, live in New York, and we also
the media center of the country.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And if you notice
the financial center.
if you notice one small thing is that Staten Island has been struggling, unbelievably in the past.
About half the casualties in the city.
Yeah, half the casualties in Staten Island. No power, no water. People might have seen this video of a woman pleading with Chuck Schumer, of saying we need relief here. And the interesting thing about this is, in the kind of media narrative, we've heard about Staten Island and we've heard about even Coney Island. People said to me, you and I both live in Brooklyn. Brooklyn's fine. Right. It's like, Coney Island is not fine, my friend.
Really is not.
And I think that this is an interesting thing, a geographic thing, is they say, well, I have power and the rest of it. And Staten Island has not been part of the conversation. And I hate to say this, but until it's really been politicized, that there's been some failures happening.
Right.
And this is becoming a much more political issue, and that's when Staten Island comes up.
And Staten Island, I just want to talk about Staten Island for a second, because Staten Island, one of my dearest friends is from Staten Island. We were emailing back and forth. I love you, Megan. And she was just saying, Staten Island has a strange relationship to the boroughs. It voted to secede in 1997. There's people there who are really suffering right now and going through a lot. And one of the things that she pointed out, there's 2 hospitals on Staten Island for 500,000 people. When the storm hit, all the bridges shut down, and one of the hospitals, which is Staten Island University Hospital, right in the water, basically was shut down immediately. So during the storm, there's one hospital for 500,000 people on an island, and that gets to your point about the broader foundation of resiliency is fundamentally the kind of public services and infrastructure and basic level of social resiliency we have before a disaster even hits. Klaus.
Well, the private sector cannot do the planning. They plan for themselves, not for the public, for the infrastructure. And that's what we really have to understand. We need good, informed government that can have the resources, which means as taxpayers we have to pitch in.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I thought we were disagreeing about that before. but look, the great symbol of this, for those of us who were in Lower Manhattan who had no power for days, I think my power came on at 4:30 this morning, was to see the glistening tower of Goldman Sachs, downtown, where the power was there. They had planned for the company. That's what private sector organizations tend to do.
Oh.
Who is going to plan for the collective? Not just New York City, but the collective in this country.
I want to push back slightly on this.
Please.
Here's the thing. I think that we set up this false binary when we're talking about sort of free market stuff or limited government people. There is a tendency to conflate libertarian ideas, or maybe even conservative ideas, which I don't speak for, but with anarchism. this Mitt Romney quote is like, well, we should put this back to the states. I don't think that there's anyone. I mean, there are people. I don't think there's a big movement of people that wants to get the government entirely out of the business of preparing for disaster. There's a lot of people that made the argument in Katrina that Walmart, there's a number of people wrote about this, a few studies about this, that pivoted really fast and provided water and everything. But I don't think anyone would seriously suggest that Walmart. Yeah, of course you can, Klaus.
Wait, hold on a second. I want you to carry through on that trash talking right after we take this commercial break. All right, we're talking about climate change and disaster and the politics thereof. And Klaus, you had something you wanted to say to Michael.
Well, Michael, I heard probably the word libertarian 20 or 30 times.
Yes. Yeah.
Honestly, I'm sick and tired of it.
Yeah. Of me saying it or Chris saying it?
No.
Just in general?
In general.
Okay.
And the reason is this is a disaster, and we shouldn't introduce ideologies into this. We have to think about what's the reality out of the street. And those that are really affected by it right now, they couldn't care less about those words. And what is needed is, right now, response of the first responders, response by the public, yes, by government, and ultimately by the society at large.
Let me defend Michael for a second. Let me jump in on your side.
Can I jump in to respond to that now?
Sure, please. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is a political issue. It is a politicized issue, and we're talking, in this context of what the right solutions are. And I just want to say, and be very, very sort of strident about this, is that nobody has a monopoly on injecting politics into an issue that should be politicized, like Benghazi. It's a political issue.
Right.
And we have the Bloomberg Business Week cover.
Right.
I had this thing in Huffington Post about, Sandy has, in fact, brought together a trifecta of progressive policy vindications.
Right.
And look, I have no problem with people saying that.
Right.
It's like, we have to talk about these issues from a political perspective because the solutions in the future are political, and our politicians, Ed Markey and everybody else, have to debate these things.
I agree with that completely, and I also think in terms of the ideological point, I do think that, I tend to be skeptical of people wanting to get rid of ideology because I think it diffuses everything. but I think the point Michael is making, which I think is a good one for liberals to hear, is that the caricature version of libertarianism, where the government doesn't do anything. I think you were saying that there's a role. You can call yourself a libertarian and still believe in disaster relief from the state, and I think that's an important point for our viewership to hear. Yeah. The other thing I want to say though is to you, Eric, and you, Klaus, and this gets to this idea of the Seagate, right? So there are some people who say, well, one way we can protect New York is to build some sea gates. They do it in seawalls. They do it in Amsterdam. It would be. I think we have an animation of a Dutch firm which drew up an animation of what this would look like. And basically, you have ships coming through, and then they can pass, and we can have ship traffic in the Verrazano Narrows. And then when the time comes and there's a huge storm surge, well, then you see the walls sort of come together there, and they go up in this sort of sci-fi-esque kind of fashion. And one of the things I want to say here is, when we think about the Army Corps of Engineers, right? Well, that's the state, that's the government, and they have this public role, and they have been disastrously dysfunctional in all kinds of ways, right? There are, the levees that they built and tested in New Orleans didn't work, and they should have. There were all sorts of reasons they should have known that the shipping channel called Mr. Go in New Orleans was creating a massive arrow pointed of storm surge at the heart of New Orleans, and they ignored those warnings. They ignored their own reports about dredging. So my question to you is, if we do put money at this, if we do commit resources to it, if we do have a DHS-like thing, what ensures me that we're going to have any better results from it than what we have from, say, the Army Corps of Engineers?
Well, here I think the key point is to return to what you said before about the kinds of people we use to lead these agencies. And I think that there's a very stark choice for Americans to make in the elections this Tuesday. Do you believe that a particular candidate can actually make good decisions about who to lead organizations like this? When Clinton was president, he put James Lee Witt in charge of FEMA. And by all accounts, from the left and the right, he did a tremendous job of revitalizing an organization to make it work to protect Americans. When Bush took over as president, He put Michael Brown in FEMA, and we all know that story. It was ludicrous to see Michael Brown criticizing President Obama today for reacting. I mean, my goodness.
Right.
So I think we can't guarantee that any particular agency will work perfectly, but we do have to think about which leader is going to put in position people who can act effectively, who will respect the professional workers in government who do such a good job. It was important to hear John Nichols talking earlier about the laborers who come out to putting their own lives at risk in situations like this. We need to maintain support for this. And I want to be clear that over the last 15 years, we have seen Republican administrations eviscerate the professional workers in federal agencies. We have seen Republican governors eviscerate state agencies. And in my view, that's what makes us less resilient and more vulnerable.
And I just want to say, because I think the point that you make picks up this idea that you say that nobody really seriously takes the idea of a lessening government. That's not really a serious point.
No, I don't mean lessening government. I mean eliminating and privatizing sort of every reaction to a disaster, for instance.
But the point that I'm going to make is the ways in which the Republican treats the head of FEMA, and they're completely ignoring the importance of that role and being willing to institute somebody who has absolutely no experience and cannot do the job signifies how willing a Republican government is to completely negate the importance of that role.
There's an ideological point here, and then there's an actual sort of partisan record point about whether you care enough to think that these functions are important.
And look, the Bush administration's record on this
Speaks for itself.
is indefensible. But I wanted to ask, actually, Eric and Klaus a question. Is this sort of conversation about money and about, how much money is being sort of allocated for this stuff and it's been cut. We have two studies we talk about. One very prescient thing that Klaus wrote, in 2009, I think, and you had mentioned a few that had kind of, in a Rasputin-like way, said this is going to happen in New Orleans too. It doesn't strike me, and this is actually a question, that this was a lack of money. It wasn't as if these projects had started and they ran out of money or the funding was cut. Am I wrong in thinking that this stuff was just never reacted to at all?
Hold that thought. I want you to answer right after we take a quick break. Sorry. Klaus, Michael asked you a question about resources and preparation, and you had something to say about New Orleans.
Let's take New Orleans. Katrina cost roughly $100 billion. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers spent, I think, in the order of $15 billion after the storm to fix the problem. It would have taken maybe $8 to $10 billion or something like that to fix it before the problem. So, for every $1 that you spend ahead of disaster, protecting against disasters, has been, on average, nationwide, shown to save you $4 of not incurred losses.
Right.
In New Orleans, it would be a 10-to-1 benefit cost.
So I should also say there are people, and Harry Shearer is one of them. He's done very good reporting on this, who say it's still not fixed. And there's folks inside the government who say the pumping stations
and that's
are not
what
working.
New York City has to think about it, because we should not fall into the trap what New Orleans did. So there's the discussion about barriers. I think all options are right now on the table. What we have to do is spending money so engineers, not lobbyists, but engineers can go through the options, price them out, and then see for how long that is good.
Well, I just want to intervene again on the political issue here, which is that the Republican Party has been against science, not just environmental science and climate science, but the science of engineering, the science of evolution. I mean, this touches something very deep in our political debate right now. And we are at a moment where we need innovative investments in scientific research. We need to think about how to rebuild cities. We need to invest in smart infrastructure, and this is part of the political decision that Americans have to make on Tuesday.
Let me say, though, science is necessary but not sufficient for these decisions.
Absolutely.
I mean, science doesn't tell you what you do. We're still a democratic polity.
We provide facts and options.
Right.
And the political process has to decide which way to go.
All right, Klaus Jacob from Columbia University, who wrote an incredibly prescient report about what would happen to New York during a storm surge, and was unfortunately borne out this week. It was great to have you at the table. Thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for being here. And Eric Kleinenberg from NYU, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate it. Why Mitt Romney is lying about the auto bailout. That's next. It's Mitt Romney asking voters, what do you want? Just tell me. I'll tell you. President Obama's revival of General Motors and Chrysler, which in all likelihood would have been liquidated had his administration not kept them above water with a government-led rescue in 2009, is pretty popular in Ohio. And that popularity is an obstacle to Mitt Romney, who opposed the key part of the rescue when initiated by the Bush administration, and who now finds himself with a stubborn polling deficit in a state he more or less has to win the presidency. So the Romney campaign has escalated their attempts to rewrite the history of the auto rescue and are now simply making things up about the current auto industry that exists today. They released this ad, which began airing last week in Ohio, that claims President Obama sold Chrysler to Italians who plan to build Jeeps in China.
Who will do more for the auto industry? Not Barack Obama. Fact checkers confirm his attacks on Mitt Romney are false. The truth? Mitt Romney has a plan to help the auto industry. He's supported by Lee Iacocca and the Detroit News. Obama took GM and Chrysler into bankruptcy and sold Chrysler to Italians who are going to build Jeeps in China. Mitt Romney will fight for every American job.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
The ad is, to put it as charitably as possible, aggressively misleading, so much so that it caused panic calls from auto workers at the Ohio Jeep plant who feared their jobs were being outsourced and prompted both GM and Chrysler to set the record straight themselves. First, in the Detroit News on Tuesday, Sergio Marchionne, the CEO of Chrysler, wrote an op-ed saying, quote, "I feel obliged to unambiguously restate our position. Jeep production will not be moved from the United States to China. Jeep assembly lines will remain in operation in the United States and will constitute the backbone of the brand. It is inaccurate to suggest anything different." Then there was this response later in the day from GM spokesman Greg Martin in the Detroit Free Press. "We've clearly entered some parallel universe during these last few days. No amount of campaign politics at its cynical worst will diminish our record of creating jobs in the U.S. and repatriating profits back to this country." The Obama campaign quickly worked up their own response ad, and yesterday the president rebutted Mitt Romney directly.
You've got folks who work at the Jeep plant who've been calling their employers, worried, asking, is it true? Are our jobs being shipped to China? And the reason they're making these calls is because Governor Romney's been running an ad that says so. Except it's not true. Everybody knows it's not true. The car companies themselves had told Governor Romney to knock it off. I know, we're close to an election, but this isn't a game. These are people's jobs. These are people's lives.
Back with us at the table now, John Nichols, my colleague at The Nation magazine, Betsy Stevenson, former chief economist in the U.S. Labor Department under President Obama. Great to have you guys back. I should note one small technicality here, right, which is that Jeep is going to open a factory to produce Jeeps in China for the Chinese market. So the point is that they are not moving jobs. There's not outsourcing. They are opening a new factory in China to produce Jeeps for the Chinese market. And I should note this is something I learned when I went to China, which is a fun and interesting fact, I think. Chinese consumers love American cars.
Yep.
Love American cars. American cars have hugely high status in China. And so American car makers are very excited about the Chinese market, just to make that point. John, what role is this auto question playing in the politics out there? You've been reporting in that region of the country for years.
It's whopping huge. I mean, it's giant because the American auto industry, when it got going, they started in Detroit, it's true, but then they kind of moved out in spokes, down to Toledo, over to Lordstown, across the lake, over to Kenosha, down into Indiana. The fact of the matter is there are very few industries in America that are so broadly spread through regions. Now, the way that most of our media covers it, it's just Michigan, right? The fact of the matter is I was an editor for the Toledo Blade for many years. Our line always was when Michigan gets a cold, Toledo's got pneumonia. Right. So this is, in many ways, auto is as big or bigger issue in Ohio for a whole bunch of reasons. And the fascinating thing about this is an intentional strategy by Mitt Romney. It is one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen in politics, and I've covered a lot of politics. He went to Defiance, Ohio. He said, I read in Bloomberg that they're gonna ship your jobs, and he said it straight on.
Yeah, he said all Jeep production
and move it all over. And then they immediately called out. And Chrysler at Fiat, Chrysler says this would take a circus acrobat to have read that article that way. So you think, oh, that's where you shut down. No. Then they go up with an ad saying it. Then they get called out by the head of Fiat. And then they get called out by GM. Then they go up with a radio ad that is even more aggressive. And then Paul Ryan goes out on the trail and goes back to some of Romney's initial arguments about they're just shipping all sorts of stuff over and totally trashing the auto bailout without ever mentioning that Paul Ryan voted for the auto bailout. It is surreal. And I have to tell you, the Toledo Blade, my old paper, front page stories each day about this isn't true. How are people responding? I think that when the history of this campaign is written, there's going to be a chapter on this, and it's going to be Mitt Romney's, it's a high bar, right. Mitt Romney's dumbest move.
Betsy, can you adjudicate a little bit this dispute about what happened in auto in terms of Mitt Romney's contention that he was basically for the policy that ended up happening, even though he clearly was intervening in the debate to make sure that policy didn't happen?
I think he wasn't for the bailout. And I don't think anyone thinks he was. He's on record saying he wasn't. But to be fair to him, there were a lot of economists who said this is private sector business. If they can't make it, we need to let them, go belly up. There were other people who said, look, we're facing the biggest credit crisis this country has faced since the Great Depression. They can't borrow the money they need. Should we let them go bankrupt because they are in this kind of problem when the entire country's financial industry is having this kind of problem? And I think it was, a legitimate decision to say, we're going to lend them that money. Not everybody supported it, though, and Romney didn't.
I want to bring in Bruce Baumauer, president of the United Auto Workers Local 12, which represents workers at the Jeep plant in Toledo, Ohio. And Bruce, I want to hear what you're making of all of this back and forth.
Well, it's been quite a week for us. You can imagine when the initial remark was made that they're transferring all Jeep production over to China. Our phones were burning up. I got in the office the next morning. I had people in there. I had three generations. I had a woman, her father, and her son, who all work at the plant, and she was in tears, thinking that there was some truth to that. So it was pretty unsettling for a day or two. But then Sergio Marchionne came out and squashed that. And we also reminded people that there's nothing new about us building Jeeps in China. We built Jeeps in China. Actually, I worked for American Motors in 1979 when they owned Jeep Corporation. And they negotiated in '79 a deal with Beijing to create a company called Beijing Jeep, and we opened up that plant in 1984.
That's amazing. That's of course Romney's old. That's of course Mitt Romney's father's old company, and it was a pioneer in Chinese production back in 1979. I want to hear more about how this is playing out politically and how you understand the stakes of this on Tuesday, right after we take this break. All right, Bruce, I want you to tell me if from the outside the basic political contours of this are the auto rescue has been the key issue in the fact that Mitt Romney has been unable to pull even or pull ahead of President Obama. He's outperforming among certain demographics, white men, for instance. Is that basic assumption I think we have in the national political press largely accurate? Is that really what it's about?
I think it is. I think the auto recovery has the Toledo piece of the auto recovery is a monumental success, and the whole northern part of Ohio recognizes the importance of that. And I think that this was a desperate effort, quite frankly, to discredit that monumental success.
John, you talked about the ways in which, and I think this is a really interesting part of this. I think people don't understand how much the productive capacity of auto, even during normal times, is constantly expanding and contracting. Absolutely. And so people are extremely attuned to where sales are going, what's happening, because shifts will be cut back and places will be furloughed, and then you'll be rehired in. And so people have a real ear for when someone says something on the campaign trail like they're closing down your plant.
Well, Bruce works with a local. I used to know when I was in Toledo a guy named Oscar Bunch, who was the head of the local there before Bruce. And Oscar, great trade unionist, used to say, that my people in the plant have been through so many cutbacks, so many layoffs, so many closings. Many of them have bumped into there from plants that closed, because you can do that in the UAW system. Toledo, I covered when the whole east side of Toledo, plant after plant after plant closed. They develop an ear, and when they hear somebody official, and I know we say politicians lie, I know we talk about that. When they hear somebody official who they don't think can lie about this say it, it is heard. And I have had UAW and steelworkers people say to me that one of their genuine fears is that you put stuff like this out, there are folks think of suicide, think of, really terrible, terrible things. I think Bruce will back that up, that there are people whose lives are so wrapped up in this work and having this work in towns that don't have a lot of other options. You play with this kind of stuff, you play politics with this, you're in a dangerous game.
Bruce.
And I think that's what's happened. I think it's backfired. That when the comments first came out last weekend, there was that real fear throughout the community for 2 or 3 days. But now that has been cleaned up by a lot of different sources, it's turned into different things. All I'm hearing now from my members, we had a big rally yesterday with about 350 people, and everybody thought it was pretty pitiful for somebody who wants to be the commander-in-chief to try to put that scare in the citizens.
Yeah. Bruce, can I ask you this question? I think people...
can tell you...
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Go ahead. I just want to tell you, we've had the entire international media besieged on Toledo this entire week. We took them around town and they saw all the construction cranes going up and all the... we're doing a $500 million expansion on that Jeep facility right now, so that we can improve our production capabilities. We're working 2 shifts right now of 10 hours each, 6 days a week, and we can't even meet the demand for a Jeep Wrangler. And we're hiring right now. We're processing 1,150 new applicants. Now, I'm not talking about folks who are coming back from the recovery. We've got all those people back. 1,150 brand new jobs that'll be working in the Jeep plant for the first time in their careers. So when they see that going on, the international media saw the cranes and the expansions going on. They just kind of scratched their head on that comment.
I just wanted to say...
I'm sorry, you had a question.
Let's come back and actually talk about the bailout was a success, right? We lent them money, and I think we need to give credit to the auto workers. We need to give credit to, the administration of GM, Chrysler. They pulled them. They got this last chance. They saw it was a last chance, and they really restructured and put that money to good use. That's why they paid back their loans. They've added jobs. We've added, since they hit bottom in 2009, we've added 250,000 jobs in the auto industry in the United States, including parts and including small parts. But that has been a success, and we have to accept that. Trying to tear that down, it's just not factually correct.
Here's my question, this goes to you, Bruce. I was talking to someone in finance yesterday who was involved in watching this process unfold from a financial perspective in terms of making bets on where the stock was going to go and how creditors were going to be worked through in the managed bankruptcy. And one of the things that was interesting is learning about the way that the auto business works and the fact that it is very exposed to crisis. It doesn't have a lot of resiliency built into it because of actually the way they have set up the business. And so my question to you is, before we declare this a success, has the industry come out of it with more resilience to a future crisis or future downturn than it had going in?
I think that was key, really, to the automotive recovery that President Obama negotiated and worked out with the companies. It wasn't just the loan itself, but it was the restructuring of the labor agreements, the whole cost structure. Our cost structures are now in line with all of our competitors, and it bodes well for future success. And the other piece of it was Sergio Marchionne becoming the CEO, and he's bringing some technology to us that we never had before, especially in terms of fuel efficiency. And I told you about the $500 million expansion. That's going to build vehicles that we're going to build that are for global consumption, not just for U.S. or North American, but global consumption. So, and we'll have those, if one market's soft and one market's strong, we'll have a variety of different products, and we'll be sending them to different markets all over the world.
You got to chuckle when Sergio Marchionne is commenting on a plant in Toledo. This is globalization for you. Bruce Bromhauer, president of the United Auto Workers, Local 12 in Ohio. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So what do we know now that we didn't know last week? My answers after this. All right, so what do we know that we didn't know last week? Well, we got another tip on another CEO asking his employees to vote for Mitt Romney. We're going to bring that to you tomorrow. What we know now is that Philip Bentivolio, brother of Michigan Republican congressional candidate Carrie Bentivolio, thinks of his family member's candidacy. Quote, I've never met anyone in my life who is conniving and dishonest as this guy, Philip Bentivoglio told the local reporter. He's my brother, so it's hard to talk about this, but I believe that if he gets elected, he'll eventually serve time in prison. We know that, amazingly, Philip's brother Kerry is favored to win the race for the seat vacated by oddball Republican Thaddeus McCotter. We know that Kerry's electoral strength comes either in spite of, or stranger yet still, because of his career as a Santa impersonator and reindeer farmer. I'm not making this up. We also know that court documents reported on during the campaign quote Kerry Bentivoglio, saying of himself that he, quote, had a problem figuring out which one I really am, Santa Claus or Kerry Bentivoglio. We know the voters of Michigan's 11th congressional district seem to have eccentric taste in representatives. We now know what we didn't know about the Missouri Senate campaign of Congressman Todd Legitimate Rape Aiken. When he torpedoed what would have been his cakewalk into the Senate with his literally medieval scientific opinions about rape and pregnancy, the National Republican Party sought to salvage its shrinking image with women by distancing themselves from Aiken, and that meant yanking their dollars too. But now, in a spending period that won't be subject to transparency until after the election's over, it turns out the Republican Party has opened the funding spigot to Congressman Aiken after all. Aiken is launching a nearly $700,000 ad buy in his state, funded in part by a National Republican committee. The RNC says it's not them. But the National Republican Senate Committee, whose chairman, John Cornyn of Texas, has said the NRSC would not be funding Aiken, has for days now declined to comment. So now we know if you donated to the NRSC because you thought your money would not help put people like Todd Aiken in the Senate, it looks like you've been had. And finally, we also know yet another realm, beyond elections, beyond ads, in which big money can shape the public discourse outside of public scrutiny or accountability. This May, the University of Wyoming took down an art installment called Carbon Sink, which used logs and coal to illustrate issues at stake in the fight over green energy, and said the piece had to come down because of water damage. But as Wyoming Public Radio first reported, the real reason was that energy companies and state lawmakers told the school to get rid of it. As Wyoming Mining Association President Marion Loomis put it in an email to the university, "What kind of crap is this?" It was, of course, the kind of crap coal companies don't want you thinking about. We know as a general rule, if coal companies don't think you should be thinking about an issue, you should definitely be thinking about it. I want to find out what my guests now know they didn't know at the beginning of the week. Mr. Moynihan.
Well, know quite a bit actually after that storm, which was enlightening. And I did a bit of reporting about some of the first responders. And what I didn't know is that in all of this kind of avalanche of coverage of all this, there was a number of very, very heroic people during this. I mean, we could figure this, but in specifically the 60th precinct in Coney Island, they were met with a 5-foot wall of water that knocked down a wall, trapping 2 steam fitters in the basement. And all of these guys, two in particular, Lieutenant O'Neill and Lieutenant Anderson, who went down, and this guy was stuck underneath a fallen wall with water levels rising, and something out of a film. And, this is confirmed by everyone. And they went down there, pulled that guy out, literally had to swim up to Neptune Avenue to buses to safety. And what I didn't know is that how many just heroic guys are in Brooklyn.
I got to say, NYU Hospital, where the staff there evacuated the NICU. I mean, the thought of having a premature child and then have to watch them be walked down 9 flights of stairs to be evacuated. No casualties lost, NYU Hospital. And I also want to give a special shout out to the unionized transit workers union folks who are right now in tunnels waist deep in water getting our subway system back to work. Thank you for all you're doing. Esther Arma.
I think we know certainly quite a bit after that conversation about climate justice with the geophysicist. How great was that for cable TV? We also know that Mitt Romney has really taught us the degree to which winning for him has become a total desecration of democracy, from voting suppression tactics to this particular moment where he's willing to play this kind of Russian roulette with people's jobs, their lives. That disconnection was a moment, I think, in which his character and his leadership came under very specific question. What we also know is that I certainly was hearing from organizations like Families United for Racial and Economic Equality in New York and Brooklyn, was about the disparate services post-Sandy to low-income communities of color. And they're talking specifically about a lot of the public housing projects where local nurses at the hospitals were talking about residents being sent to hospital because there weren't enough services.
Red Hook is really hurting right now. Red Hook, a neighborhood in Brooklyn, large public housing. There's a group called Red Hook Initiative that's been doing some good work. You can look that up. We'll put a link to our website. John Nichols.
I know that all those fights we had about trade unions and public employees last year, we see why we fought. because we've seen some heroic stories and things that have been talked about. I also know that coming up on Tuesday, we're going to have a lot of talk about the presidential race. We won't pay enough attention to down ballot races. What excites me is that there's a lot of action out there, real important races, real important people running. But there's also something we should be aware of. Everything we talk about with Citizens United and big money coming in, it's coming in down ballot, particularly in judicial races. I'll just remind folks of the race in Michigan, where a woman named Bridget McCormick, a University of Michigan law professor, started their Innocence Clinic up there. Brilliant professor running for judge, got hit last week with $1 million of advertising saying she's sympathetic to terrorism.
Wow.
Or more or less from a group called the Judicial Crisis Network, not out of Michigan. Right. They just don't want her on the court. And it was a brutal attack because she had made efforts to help to make sure that folks at Guantanamo were represented.
We've seen that smear
She stood up for the rule of law and got attacked. We should be aware of these kinds of fights.
Betsy Stevenson.
So we got our jobs report yesterday, and I think what that showed us was that we are making steady progress in this recovery. And I think one of the most telling things out of that report was the August numbers were revised up again, nearly another 50,000. So when those numbers were first reported, we thought we were doing terribly, adding less than 100,000 jobs. We now think August we added 200,000. And it's a reminder that what we have to look at is the history of this recovery. And it's been a recovery where we're steadily adding jobs, we're steadily bringing the unemployment rate down. Everyone wants it to be faster, but let's make sure we keep going that direction.
It's also a reminder, I have stopped covering the monthly jobs report because the confidence interval is so wide. The margin of error is plus or minus 100,000 jobs. There's so many revisions, and we would chase it every month, and I just stopped doing it because it was like, this is just a preliminary guesstimate, basically, of what it is. So my thanks to Michael Moynihan from Newsweek and the Daily Beast, Esther Arma from WBAI-FM, John Nichols from The Nation magazine, and Betsy Stevenson from the University of Michigan. It was really great today. Thank you so much for getting up. Thank you for joining us today for Up. Join us tomorrow, Sunday morning at 8. We'll have my boss at The Nation magazine, Katrina vanden Heuvel, and legendary New York Times veteran Bob Herbert on the final days of the campaign and what comes afterward. Coming up next is Melissa Harris Perry on today's MHP. MSNBC's own New Orleans resident gives her take on Hurricane Sandy and the response. And Melissa's letter today is for Michael Brown. That and Mitt Romney's auto absurdity. That's Melissa Harris Perry coming up next. We'll see you right here tomorrow at 8, the last day before the election. Thanks for getting up.